Hey everyone, we are in chapter 15b. We are on slide 27. Sorry, it's a little hidden there. Slide 27. We've talked about the first 8 cranial nerves. Now let's talk about the last 4. We are on cranial nerve number 9. 9 in Roman numerals is IX. This is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal. Glosso refers to the tongue. Pharyngeal refers to your throat. So this is a nerve that innervates your tongue and throat. We've already seen a nerve that innervates a portion of the tongue. Remember, the facial nerve innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue for taste, and then the maxillary nerve innervates the tongue for touch. What nerve did I say? The mandibular nerve, the trigeminal nerve, third branch, mandibular nerve, not maxillary. I think I said maxillary. Mandibular nerve innervates the tongue for touch, temperature, pain, itch. The facial nerve innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue for taste. The glossopharyngeal nerve also innervates the tongue, the posterior third of the tongue. Facial nerve was for anterior 2/3. Glossopharyngeal nerve is for the posterior third of the tongue, for both somatosensation and taste. Both somatosensation and taste. Let's draw out each of those pathways. If I want to sense, let's say, the fact that I've touched my posterior third of my tongue, posterior third of my tongue is over here. I have dendrites, let's say, of a Pacinian corpuscle. The axon goes to the medulla. Our destination is the medulla oblongata. And this is going to be a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So our cell body is over here in a cranial ganglion. Don't worry about the specific name. It's in a cranial ganglion. That would be one for sensing touch or temperature or pain or itch. If you want to sense taste, remember that we have special gustatory cells that are part of a taste bud. And then those gustatory cells send information to a sensory neuron, which is not going to be pseudo-unipolar, it's going to be bipolar. And we're going to send that information to the medulla, which will eventually make its way to the gustatory cortex. To the thalamus, then the gustatory cortex. That would be the sensory part of this glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal is sensory, but it is also, guess what? It's also motor. So this is a mixed nerve. We start in the medulla, just lateral to the olives. If you take a look at this picture over here, far left, what I'm circling right now are the olives of the medulla, those 2 round bulges. Just lateral of the olives, that's where you can find the glossopharyngeal nerves. For motor control, this is motor control of your salivary gland. When I say motor, I mean efferent. So let me put that down. Not necessarily controlling muscles, but controlling secretion in this case also. So we're controlling secretion from the salivary gland. One of the salivary glands is called the parotid salivary gland, or we can control pharyngeal muscles for swallowing. Either way, for this pathway, we would have a multipolar neuron starting in the medulla, and its axon extends out and goes to one of those muscles, let's say, for swallowing. That's what that neuronal pathway would look like. All of these axons, all those axons are part of the glossopharyngeal nerve, whether it's sensory or motor, and they go through a hole in the base of the skull. The hole is the jugular foramen. It's the same jugular foramen that the jugular vein passes through. That's where the name comes from. I'm going to clear this, go to slide 5, and show you where the jugular foramen is. The jugular foramen is in between two bones. It's in between the temporal bone and the occipital bone. And it's a decently big hole because it needs to fit that jugular vein, and we're going to see other nerves that pass through the same hole, the jugular foramen. So that's the glossopharyngeal nerve. Sensory, because it can sense from the posterior third of the tongue, somatosensory and taste, and then can also control one of your salivary glands. It's called the parotid. We're going to go over the different ones later, but it controls one of the salivary glands and muscles for swallowing, pharyngeal muscles for swallowing. So tongue and throat, glossopharyngeal. The 10th nerve, cranial nerve 10, 10 is X, is the vagus nerve, spelled V-A-G-U-S, vagus, not like Las Vegas, V-E-G-A-S, V-A-G-U-S. This is for control of many of your organs. It's for parasympathetic control of your cardiovascular system, of your respiratory system, of your digestive system. And for sensation from these systems as well. So we get input and output. This is a mixed nerve. You have both sensory and motor portions to the vagus nerve. It is your longest nerve. The trigeminal was the biggest. It had the most axons. It was the thickest. This is the longest. It starts, take a look at this picture over here. It starts over here in the medulla and then can extend either to the throat or to the heart or to the lungs or to the stomach, to the intestines. It's a really long nerve. Funnily enough, it's not your longest nerve, but it is a very long nerve. If we look at a sensory pathway, that means we're sensing stuff from our organs. This would be visceral sensory because we're sensing stuff from organs. And those are going to have pseudo-unipolar neurons, if you remember what we talked about, neuron shape. So let's say we want to know how inflated our lungs are. It's important to know the state of your lungs. How we don't want to overinflate our lungs, and if our lungs aren't inflated when they should be, then that's also a problem. So we want to maintain the state of our lung inflation. So we have stretch receptors in our lungs. I'm just going to draw dendrites here for our receptors. The axon continues up to the medulla and ends at the medulla. And this is pseudo-unipolar, so the cell body's off to the side in one of these ganglia, one of these cranial ganglia. That would be a sensory pathway using the vagus nerve. For motor, what are we controlling? We're controlling either muscles of the throat to close our throat, muscles of the pharynx to close the throat, muscles of the larynx for speech. So that would be somatic motor, controlling skeletal muscle. For visceral motor, we're controlling smooth muscle or cardiac, because we'd be controlling muscles for breathing. Well, I guess that would also be skeletal, but muscles for breathing, or no, sorry, not for breathing. This would be for your airways. Your airways are lined with smooth muscle. Cardiovascular would be heart and digestive organs, stomach, intestines, stuff like that. There's more to it than that, but those are just some prime examples. So let's say you want to make your stomach digest. You want to make your stomach move and rumble around. I'm going to draw it up here. You'd have your multipolar neuron starting in the medulla. It exits out, goes down, 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 and ends at the stomach. It's actually a little more nuanced than that. Since this is a parasympathetic pathway, we're going to learn that there's actually another neuron, and it's very short. So I'm going to draw another multipolar neuron that goes to the stomach. We'll learn about that second neuron in this we'll learn about the second neuron in this parasympathetic pathway coming up in chapter 17, 18. But the first neuron, that blue one, uses the same pathway of the vagus nerve. It is part of the vagus nerve, and it can travel all the way to the stomach to cause it to contract, to cause it to move and rumble around, slosh everything and mix everything up. Regardless if whether this is the sensory or the motor pathway, it goes through the same hole. That hole is also the jugular foramen. We saw this with glossopharyngeal nerve. It goes through that same hole. In terms of where it comes out on the base of the brain, look just lateral of the pyramids. So here you can see a pyramid. Here you can see another pyramid. It's going to be these large ones. Oops, these large ones coming out this way. That's the vagus. Those are the vagus nerves. Now, I've mentioned here that vagus nerve is for sensing stuff from your organs and for controlling your throat and speech and controlling your organs. Control how fast your heart is beating, how hard it beats, controlling movement in your stomach and your intestines, controlling the size of your airways. It actually does one more thing. The vagus nerve also is for taste. It's for the very, very back region of your tongue and pharynx. So I know 2/3 plus 1/3 equals 1, but add a little bit more to that. Your facial nerve, you're sensing from gustatory cells. Draw a bipolar neuron. That'd be from the facial nerve, from the glossopharyngeal nerve, from the posterior third, sensing from gustatory cells, and then from the vagus nerve, we have our bipolar neuron leading to the medulla. So 3 different nerves are for taste. It just depends on which portion of the tongue we're from. Gustatory cell is activated by some molecule that we can taste. We travel along one of these 3 nerves. We end in a nucleus. Don't worry about the name of the nucleus. We end in a nucleus within the medulla. From here, we activate another neuron, and this is going to be multipolar because now we're in the central nervous system. This leads to the thalamus. This leads to the thalamus, a nucleus within the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, we have one more neuron that leads to the gustatory cortex. If you recall, the gustatory cortex is found within that insular cortex. Insular cortex is that hidden cortex within the lateral sulcus. So 3 different nerves that allow for sensation of taste, for gustation. Facial nerve, anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Glossopharyngeal nerve, posterior third of the tongue. Vagus nerve, very, very back of the tongue, and also a bit of your pharynx you can taste. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve. You might see it called the spinal accessory nerve. It's the same thing. I'm just going to call it the accessory nerve. The accessory nerve is motor. It is not sensory. It is not mixed. It is a motor nerve. Controls major throat and neck muscles. Where it's coming from at the base of the brain, it's coming off from the medulla. It's in an interesting location. Take a look. Let me draw where vagus nerve was. Here in blue, this is number 10. here in green, and there's many branches here coming from either side. This is 11, the accessory nerve. It's called spinal accessory because you can see part of it goes down to the spinal cord. It's more caudal than the medulla. It goes through the jugular foramen, just like those other two, just like glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve goes through the jugular foramen and the jugular vein. If we're going from the cranial portion, it can either go to the muscles of the soft palate, so helping with swallowing, pharynx and larynx. So you can see there's a little bit of overlap here too. Glossopharyngeal and vagus, also innervated muscles of the throat. And then we can also control the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles, because those are muscles of the neck. So if I were to draw a pathway for that, take a look at this picture at the top right. Our accessory nerve would start with a neuron in the medulla, multipolar, exiting, let's say, down to the sternocleidomastoid. There's our pathway for controlling our sternocleidomastoid. Neuron starts in the medulla, exits out as the accessory nerve, goes through the jugular foramen, ends at the sternocleidomastoid. So still, you know, a bit here to remember, but relatively simpler compared to, say, the vagus nerve. It's just a motor nerve. Our last nerve, cranial nerve 12, is the hypoglossal nerve. Hypo means below, glossal means tongue. We've seen glossal already with the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal was for taste from the tongue. That was sensation from the tongue. Hypoglossal is for control of the tongue. The way I think about it is like if you have nerves going from underneath the tongue, there are no taste buds under the tongue, they're all on the top. So it's not for taste, you're controlling the movement. Hypoglossal is for tongue movement, it's motor. Let me direct your attention to this base of the brain again. Where I'm drawing right now in blue, this is 10. Where I'm drawing in pink, this is 11. Oops. What's interesting about 12 is that it's not the most caudal. 11 is the most caudal cranial nerve. You'd think that we're going from rostral to caudal in terms of this naming, but this is not, number 12 is not the most caudal. You have to go a bit more medial and rostral to find it. In green, here is cranial nerve 12. And it's between the pyramids and the olives. You can find it between the pyramids and the olives of the medulla. If we're controlling tongue movement, that means if you take a look over here, the top right, let's draw a neuron here in the medulla oblongata, axon extending out, controlling our tongue. That would be our pathway for control of our tongue using the hypoglossal nerve. The hole that it passes through is the hypoglossal canal. The hypoglossal canal is another hole separate from the others, just for the hypoglossal nerve. Let's actually take a look at that. We're on slide 31. Let's go all the way back to slide 5. The hypoglossal canal is part of the occipital bone. You can see foramen magnum right here. Just look a little bit lateral of foramen magnum. That's the hypoglossal canal, one on either side. And it's more medial. It's more medial of the jugular foramen. See the jugular foramen right here. Smaller, more medial of jugular foramen. So that covers all 12, but I think it'll be helpful to recap all of these and give you some ways to remember all these different names. So here's some mnemonics on how to remember different aspects of the cranial nerves. If you're just remembering the order, naming each one, you can use ooh, ooh, ooh to touch and feel very good velvet, such heaven. The first O is for olfactory, second O is for optic, third O is for oculomotor. They're all O, you just have to remember the order here. And it goes in order of, sense. Your nose is most anterior, so this is first. Your eye is second, and that's going to be vision second, and then third is movement of your eye, oculomotor. Then you get two T's. The first T is trochlear, more eye movement. Fifth is trigeminal. The A for and is abducens. F is facial. V is vestibulocochlear. G, the good, is glossopharyngeal. Velvet is vagus. S is for spinal accessory. If you want to make it just accessory, you can make it like heaven or something like that. Make the mnemonic fit for what you want. And then the H is for hypoglossal. This is just one mnemonic to help you remember. You can change it however you want. The whole point of this is to help you remember. So if you want to change a word and make it more memorable, usually dirty things make it more memorable, I encourage you to change it for yourself. That's remembering the names. To remember the function, here's another mnemonic. Some for sensory say, let me back up. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. S equals sensory. M equals motor. B equals both. We've learned how some nerves are sensory, some nerves are motor, some nerves are both. In the order of what they are, we see that olfactory is sensory, optic is sensory, oculomotor is motor, trochlear is motor, trigeminal is both, abducens is motor, facial is both, vestibulocochlear is sensory, glossopharyngeal is both, vagus is both, accessory is motor, hypoglossal is motor. So this helps you remember what function they are overall, sensory, motor, or both. Once again, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. If that mnemonic works for you, great. If you want to change a word around to something that'll make you help you remember it better, I encourage you to change those names to something else. Those are some mnemonics. Here are some more. Actually, we'll get to this one in a second. If you want some more mnemonics, here is, take a look at this guy right here. I'm going to trace over it in pink. Cranial nerve 1 is for smell. Cranial nerve 2 is for vision. So we're going to draw 2 as the eyes. Cranial nerve 3 is for eye movement. So we're going to put it above as part of the eye. 4 is also for eye movement. Trigeminal 5 is for chewing and also from feeling different parts of your face. Cranial nerve 6 is also for eye movement, so I'll put it around the eye. Cranial nerve 7 is facial, for controlling muscles of your face and also for taste. Cranial nerve 8 is for hearing and for balance, so we'll make those the ears. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, for the taste and for your throat. Cranial nerve 10, this one's kind of weird. Vagus, we just have it go hanging off from like a tie or something. Cranial nerve 11 for moving your neck and shoulders. Cranial nerve 12, that's your tongue. So we can draw a facial mnemonic like this. Draw a little person, a face, and have numbers correspond to different parts of the body. This drawing over on the left helps you remember where they are on the ventral inferior surface of the brain. Cranial nerve 1 is coming off the olfactory bulbs. Cranial nerve 2 forms at the chiasm. Cranial nerve 3 is very medial of the pons. This big thing is the pons. And it would be more for the midbrain. Cranial nerve 4, a little bit lateral. Cranial nerve 5, very lateral of the pons. Cranial nerve 6, it's between the pons and medulla. Cranial nerve 7, also between the pons and medulla, more lateral. Cranial nerve 8, more lateral of that. Cranial nerve 9, now we're lateral of the medulla itself. Cranial nerve 10, more caudal, more lateral. Cranial nerve 11, it branches a lot, goes to the spinal cord. And then cranial nerve 12 is in the middle, coming off right here. So I encourage you to draw these yourself because it'll help you remember where they all are. And so what you should also be able to do besides recognize the different foramina, recognize how each nerve, what the basic function is, based on what their basic function is, you should be able to know what tests are relevant to testing each nerve. So here in this first picture, let's call this picture 1. In this first picture, we're covering the patient's eye and having them track our finger. We could be testing a number of things. We're testing their vision, so that's cranial nerve 2. We're testing their eye movement because we're asking them to follow our eye. That's cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6. 4 different nerves tested here, depending on what we do, what we ask the patient to do. Here in this second picture, we're asking the person to shrug up. To shrug up, you're controlling your trapezius. That's your accessory nerve. That's cranial nerve 11. If you ask in this third picture, if you ask someone to open their mouth, they're using a muscle of mastication. Or I guess you could say muscle of mastication, or if they use their platysma, facial expression. If it's a muscle of mastication, then it's trigeminal third branch, mandibular division. If we're testing the platysma, then it's the facial nerve. If we ask them to stick their tongue out, so this is number 4, if we ask them to stick their tongue out, that means they are controlling with the 12th nerve, hypoglossal. If we want them to blow with their cheeks, use muscles like your buccinator. These are muscles of facial expression. That would be facial. If we touch them very lightly on their face and we ask them to tell us, can they feel it? Specifically in this region of their face, here in picture 6, that would be the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. So it would be V2. Oopsies, sorry, that's 7. V2, there we go. Those are all the different tests. Well, those aren't all the different tests. Those are some examples of tests that you can do to test cranial nerves. And of course, there are more. And so I'd like you to think about and perhaps look up the different tests that you can do for all the different nerves based on their basic functions. You just want to see if it's working properly. Find a very simple, quick test to make sure that they're working. Like, can you smell something? Can you identify the smell? If I spin you around in a chair, can you maintain your balance? Things like that. Here we are in complete anatomy. We're looking at a skull that's been cut, top of the head's been cut off. And so we can take a closer look at the skull foramina for these cranial nerves to pass through. So we look at the base of the cranium. Whoops. These tiny little holes that are part of the ethmoid. Not cooperating with me today. All right, good enough. These tiny little holes, all these little holes within the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, those are the olfactory foramina. That's for cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 2 is the hole for it is hiding. You can see cranial nerve 2 passing through here in pink. So the hole is right here. I'm actually going to erase what I've drawn so I can show you better. If you tilt the head this way, you can see these holes on either side. This is within the sphenoid. These are the optic canals. That's for cranial nerve 2. And then if you rotate the head a little bit more, you can see, whoops. Here's the optic canal for cranial nerve 2. And then here in green, you can see this large hole. That's the superior orbital fissure. For cranial nerve 3, 4, 5, 1, and 6. 4 different nerves, 4 different cranial nerves pass through the superior orbital fissure. So if I go back to that standard view where we were, olfactory foramina are here. Optic canal hiding under here, superior orbital fissure. Just posterior to the superior orbital fissure is this hole that you can see right here. And this is foramen rotundum. Rotund means big and round. It's kind of big, kind of round. I mean, so are all these holes, but that's what it's called, foramen rotundum. If you go a little farther back, I'm going to use a different color now. There's a hole right here. That's foramen lacerum. It's not one of the holes I'm asking you to know because it doesn't have a cranial nerve go through it. And then there's a tiny little hole right here. That's foramen spinosum. Also not asking you to know that one. But this one here, this is foramen ovale. Superior orbital fissure has trigeminal nerve first branch, ophthalmic. Foramen rotundum has the second branch, maxillary. Ovale has the third branch, mandibular. After that, we have both cranial nerve 7 and 8 go through this hole here. You can see both nerves coming through on the other side. This is the internal acoustic meatus. If I rotate this a little bit, let me redraw this. Here we can see a really big hole on the border of the temporal and occipital bones. That's the jugular foramen. And then these tiny holes on either side of foramen magnum, that is the hypoglossal canal. These are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different holes of the skull that allow cranial nerves to pass through. Now let's switch to looking at the cranial nerves on a human brain. I'm going to pull up a picture. We're looking at the inferior ventral aspect of the brain. It helps to have some frame of reference here. So let's point out some major structures. What I'm tracing right now in black, those are the olfactory tracts. And then these rounded parts are the bulbs. Down here, this crossing, that's the optic chiasm. You can barely see the midbrain here. I'm going to color the midbrain, trace the corpora quadrant. Sorry, they're not the corpora quadrant. That's on the other side, but the midbrain is barely visible here. The pons is this big round thing. And then the different parts of the medulla. Remember, we have our pyramids. And then the olives. The pyramids and the olives of the medulla. Those are useful landmarks to figure out where these other cranial nerves are. Cranial nerve 1 comes out, it leads into the olfactory bulbs. Cranial nerve 1 leads into the olfactory bulbs. Cranial nerve 2, they're cut right here. They lead into the optic chiasm. Cranial nerve 3 is coming from the midbrain. Oculomotor. Cranial nerve 4 is super thin. It doesn't show very well here, but it would be coming out just lateral of the pons. Cranial nerve 5 is this thick one that you see on either side, just lateral of the pons. Cranial nerve 6 is coming, cranial nerve 6 is coming from the in between the pons and medulla, more medially. Whoops. It's coming up this way. That's number 6. Cranial nerve 7 is lateral of that color. It's coming from the medulla. Cranial nerve 8 is lateral of that, right next to it. Cranial nerve 9 is coming lateral of the olives. Let me erase my drawing of the olives. It's covering it up. Cranial nerve 9 is lateral of the olives. Cranial nerve 10 is a little more also lateral of the olives, but a little more caudal. Let's do that in green. Cranial nerve 11, it's the one that branches a lot more towards the spinal cord. Oops, we just use green. Let's use blue. And then cranial nerve 12, we have to go back rostrally in between the pyramids and the olives. That's 12. That's the approximate location of each one. And you can see some of those nerves here. This isn't, it'll be more apparent when we see this in lab and look in the actual brain. But I hope those are some useful landmarks. This will take some practice, a lot of small nerves and figuring out the location, the function, what holes they go through. I encourage you to use complete anatomy to start out and figure out basic orientations. The links are under the Canvas videos. And then lab will hopefully help you to get a handle of real brain. All right. There's a lot here in these past 3 videos. Please let me know if you have any questions. I can help you. I will do my best to help you. Leave any questions in the comments in the discussion, and I'll see y'all later. Thanks, everyone.